Well, it's a hard day for a lot of people out there, and at Tauri, we've got a global community, so I think all of us are in some way, directly or indirectly, touched by the events. And I personally think, and I guess I can sort of speak for the core team at Tauri because you know we all are pretty much aligned that in these kind of troubling times, the worst thing you can do is be paralyzed. And the worst thing that you can do is accept the status quo. And that's kind of the story of Tauri and how we got to where we are today. Our project has people talking about it on Hacker News and State of JS, and it's something that's just been growing over time. It's a kind of normal growth curve, I think. But I'm going to leave this chart up here for a second so I can talk a little bit about where we came from. Back in the summer of 2019, my friend and colleague Lucas and I were trying to find a better way to do things. We just weren't satisfied with Node, WebKit, Atom Shell, Electron. It always just seemed to be such a huge waste of resources. And I mean, we don't even want to talk about security yet, but we'll get to that. We looked at a lot of different languages to bind to web views. In fact, we used at the core the really amazing WebView library written by Serge. Some of you might know that project. It was adopted by Buskup and wrapped into Rust. And basically, it's a bunch of C and C++ and a bit of Objective-C, and it has bindings to all of the system web views, which seemed like a great idea at the time. And our very first proof of concept was written in Go, but then we did one in Rust, and I think we just loved the pain because back then we'd heard of Rust. Neither of us had used it. And we thought, well, the types of guarantees that you get are pretty exciting. And we both fell in love with the compiler messages. It just seemed that somebody had put a lot of thought and effort into making it an enjoyable experience because I guess the worst thing that can happen is undefined behavior. I mean, okay, we're not going to get into the Rustnomicon and unsafe behavior. I'll talk a little bit about how we deal with unsafe later. But as time grew or passed, we started trending all of the time, and this grew our community. And we'll talk about community in a little while as well. It got to the point where, today, I took these screenshots today. So today we're in the top 300 projects on GitHub, and we're still in the throes of releasing our 1.0. I mean, our RC is just about to be released, and in the top 300 projects on GitHub, I guess there's like 18 million or something, but only 4 of them are written in Rust, or 5, excuse me. I think there's another one that we just edged out. But it's interesting to see that if you go down in the star charts to around 10,000, there's a lot more Rust, and Rust is definitely picking up in the library and the binary and the WASM industry. And I don't want to say that we are taking credit or we are riding the wave. I think for a lot of things, Rust makes a lot of sense, and that brings me to security. I guess one of the things we all have to recognize today is that we can't really trust any of our devices. If you've been following Twitter, you understand that there are already massive rootkits being spread around the Ukraine, and people are getting their data encrypted, and it's not a sign of the times. We've known about this for decades, and you know, we claim to make smaller, faster, and more secure desktop applications, and we struggle with this misperception that there is ever a circumstance where security shouldn't be a concern. That's actually from one of the issues on our GitHub issue tracker. And I think that the problem with this perception is also fostered by the industry. Um, when we as library and framework engineers push the tough decision making about security to application developers, it's a hard and heavy lift because the ease with which it is possible to make an application today means that you don't have to have a rigorous computer science degree. It means that, you might just be satisfying your own whimsy, or you might be working for a Fortune 500. And in both of those cases, I can tell you, there are sometimes bigger concerns than security, but we're here to tell you that there shouldn't be. And we don't want the software you make to become an attack vector that allows the bad guys to move laterally inside of people's computers or corporate networks. That's why we contracted out to Radically Open Security the job of horizontally and vertically auditing the Tauri code base. What that means is we had a logic audit. That's the horizontal one where all of the libraries were reviewed for soundness, for smell, for glaring security holes, and they found a lot of stuff. And this kind of raises the point that even if you have the best intentions, getting a second pair, third pair, fourth pair of eyes on the thing that you're building is really important. And since we're building a framework, it's doubly important. One of the recommendations that the auditors gave us is something that we're going to be returning to in the next months, and that is that we want to help people to employ more secure coding practices and provide tooling that gives you at compile time heads ups and allows you to integrate with your continuous integration pipeline to throw a non-zero error if one of your requirements hasn't been met. Just talking about the security aspects of Tauri would be, I don't know, probably a 45-minute introduction. But I also don't want you to just take my word for it. We are working on a very large body of documentation, and I'm just cherry picking a couple things here. So, as you may know, Tauri uses a webview as the user interface and provides a Rust-based core backend. And we also provide an API by which the user interface can communicate with the core. So for example, let's say you just want to read a binary file and dump the contents into the user interface. Well, we do this with message passing. And so you would pass a message calling the API to the core. The core would then find that file if you've granted the application permissions to read that specific folder, and then return however you want to get that information back. I mean, if it's a JPEG, you could just, get the image back. Now, you might hear a lot of alarm bells going off in your head. Oh my gosh, unsafe JavaScript. And I have to tell you, the web is a hot steaming mess. The moment you are consuming any kind of third-party package, whether it's a Node module, a Rust crate, or even a WASM blob, you're accepting that the person who wrote it is a good person, that they have your best interests at hand. And we know this isn't the case. Um, in fact, you could also use a CDN to deliver JavaScript into your app, or who knows, you might actually render an entire website from Slack HQ or whatever into the web view. And the issue is not your code, because obviously you're doing a good job, but an attacker can, with enough pen testing, social engineering, GitHub reviewing, detect that you're calling certain APIs. Maybe they know that you've accept listed the entire body of APIs, and they want to read your etc shadow file. If you've permitted everything, then maybe it's possible for them to do that. And what the isolation pattern does is it provides a secure pathway so that only trusted code can call that API. Now, there's an entire write-up on this page. I encourage you to read about it if you're interested. But we're not just here to protect your users. I think that we can talk about security forever. As engineers living in a very, well, I wasn't prepared to say dangerous, but it is a dangerous world. A dying world is actually what I wanted to say. We all feel that it's absolutely relevant to take every step that we can to protect the environment. And if you're used to downloading normal applications for Linux, Windows, or Mac, you're used to things being several hundred megabytes. I think recently I saw that the VS Code project is about 500 megabytes. Slack is like 300. And I'm not picking on Electron here. Even native applications, so-called native applications coming directly from Mac, well, they also weigh in at 50 to 200 to even gigabytes in size. And so one of the things that we are constantly striving to do is reduce the size of Tauri applications. So obviously there's ways that you can strip binaries, and that last image was a Tauri Gulf project, a hello world without a JavaScript front-end framework that was then UPX binary compressed. And so it's not exactly a way that you would really do production binaries. In the field, if you're using Vue or React, you'll see an app size of about 3 megabytes. If you are really careful about, embedding fonts and applying all of the build time optimizations, 3 megabytes is pretty normal. And, it's similar for other applications using other systems, whether it's NWJS or Electron or WebView. 200 is pretty normal. When they ship an Electron app, for example, you're shipping a Chromium browser, you're shipping a Node runtime, you're shipping all of your JavaScript compressed as an ASAR. And for a long time that worked well. But this afternoon I spent more time than I would like to admit, but I spent a little time going through some typical scenarios for app life cycles. And so what you see here is, the download time for a single unit of an app. So if it's a Tauri app, it would be 3. A medium-sized app of 200 would take, it's 200 megabytes. That's, about 16 seconds to download on a normal 100 MBS system. And then we have the number of downloads. So, if it's a hobby app, you might get 1,000 downloads over time. If it's bigger, it might be 100,000. And if it's even bigger, well, I mean, if you're a very, 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 very successful app that's around for several years and you push out updates regularly, I can tell you that the 10 million number isn't actually very far away from reality, maybe on the short side. And then, you calculate the transit, how much, electricity you really consumed. And if you start really doing the math, like one big, very successful app produces enough CO2 that it would need 2,160,000 trees to be mature in order to remove the CO2 that they've produced. I mean, hey, we can argue about, if it's 0.06 kilograms of CO2 or 0.1 kilowatts per hour per gigabyte. The point is that it's utterly relevant today that we start finding systems to do this for us. And I'm not going to lie, I cut my teeth on Electron and Cordova and these monolithic, massive apps because it was a great way to learn and to grow as a developer. But we feel that it's not exactly responsible. And one of the criticisms that we get is that we're using system web views that might not have the perfect layout on Mac as they do on Windows, and there's tons of problems on Linux. And I think that the community is okay with it. It might be a little bit more work to get it to be a little bit faster, a lot smaller, a bit more secure. And maybe it's not always. Is it not always? I mean, the criticism is that there's problems on WK WebKit on Mac and WebKit GTK, and there's CSS rendering problems, and it's not always the same on all platforms. But as someone who's been involved in the web for the better part of 2 decades, I can tell you it's always been that way on every browser. I mean, seriously, try to use Google Meets on Firefox, on Linux. I mean, come on. And so when we started this project, we knew that we weren't going to be able to do it alone. And we knew that we wanted to bring people in. And so as a team, we created a system for our working group that basically says everyone is welcome. If you want to join the working group to get involved to, I don't know, help out with making our docs site better, or you have a very clear idea of how Tauri should work on Android, or you have a great time just helping people answer questions, we're always open. And because of our security policy for cutting new releases and the way we review all of the code, we really prefer the tofu approach, trust on first use. You come, you want to get involved, you're absolutely welcome to. And I think that that's a model that really grew out of, off the heels of free and libre open source software, where that community came from was, yeah, we can do this together and we want to do it together. So we don't raise the bar to make it difficult. There's no, tests. Just show up and say, hey, I want to help. And in order to take that kind of one step further with our community, we joined the Commons Conservancy. So the entire code base is owned by a foundation in the Netherlands. So it's the Tauri program within the Commons Conservancy. That's our SPDX claim on all the files, in all of the repos. And the reason why this is important is because as the project has grown, we wanted to not only address the very real concerns of maintainership burnout, but also um, hostile takeovers and the ability for funding to come in and change the project in ways we didn't want it to change. And that's why there is no open core model. Everything is open. Everything is dual licensed MIT, Apache 2.0, and it's always going to stay that way. Now, we also have an open collective. We've been collecting funds to pay for the audits. You're welcome to donate there. The thing that we've noticed is that some companies started to donate, which is great, and some developers started to donate, which is great. But we sort of feel like the open source community needs to come together and figure out a way to turn open source, the free part of open source into something other than free real estate. That's this kind of ideological model of open source that's sort of been, I don't know, crushing us for such a long time as a community. And it's why people burn out, and it's why people only do open source on weekends and nights. And I don't know. I think that that's something that we can all address and work toward changing. Now, I've talked a lot about kind of the high level stuff, so I'm going to come down a couple thousand feet and talk about the pieces that make up Tauri. And so we built a number of Rust crates. I alluded at the beginning to the way in which we were interacting with the WebView community via the project from zSerge. And what we discovered there was we were constantly using multiple language paradigms in order to address different operating systems. And so we sort of went back to basics. And I mean, actually, the first thing we built was Rye, the WebView rendering library that injects it into a window. But we needed to create a window, and we were using at first the amazing Winit project. But at a certain point, our approach needed to diverge, because we needed to, not just make windows, but add menus and a system tray and keyboard accelerators. And there was really no great way to do that with, I'm not going to get into the details of who owns the loop, but we needed to make sure that the application at its root was, responsible for menuing, system traying, and accelerators. So we forked Winit, and it was sort of with a heavy heart, but we're working toward modularizing the things that we've added to Winit to call it Tau, so that it can potentially be reabsorbed back upstream by Winit. So again, Tau is our windowing agent, and Rye provides the WebView interface to, well, at the moment we have a stable Windows WebView interface. We have a stable Mac OS WebView interface, and Linux is also stable. So basically we're using WebView 2. A big, huge shout out to Bill Wavery from Microsoft for helping us integrate with Windows RS. It was amazing to also see him constantly come back and helping us update. Shows that the community is very, very strong. We're using WK WebKit on Mac OS, which is the WebView provided by Mac. I think it also has room for improvement, and we're looking forward to engaging with that community as time goes on, and continuing our engagement. And for Linux, we're using WebKit GTK. And WebKit GTK is also a special case, but the fun doesn't really stop there, because on Windows and Mac, you always really know more or less what's serving up your window. But on Linux, there's a variety of things you have to contend with, whether it's uh, X server, or if you're using GNOME, or I mean, the matrix of possibilities on Linux really makes that system into a whole number of unique edge cases that we're still working on. So anyone out there really interested in getting involved, I think that Linux is is the family where a lot of attention could be spent, especially with regard to packaging. But that's Tauri. So Tauri takes the Tau and the Win uh, libraries and adds APIs, application structure, and build tooling into the mix. And so with the APIs, what you end up getting are uh, things you can call from, well, things, low level system interfaces that you can call from Rust or from JavaScript in the user interface. And so, we've provided interfaces to classical things like the file system and, the dialogue for where do you open or save a file. And we also offer an interface to, spawn a shell and run a command in a shell. And all of these APIs are protected by an accept list. So basically what that means, in your configuration file, you then determine which parts of the JavaScript system and which parts of the Rust system you want to use in your final binary. And it's one of those twofers. Well, on the one hand, you have a smaller binary size, and on the second hand, you have a smaller attack surface area. And instead of placing the entire V8 engine inside of your application, you're only placing the exact things that you need. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir. I think everybody here understands that. And with our build tooling, we obviously provide a CLI that allows you to create a new project, to create a dev server that allows you to interact with the application as you're working on it, and also a build pipeline. And so what this means is that Tauri kind of brings all of the pieces together, and at the same time, it might not be something for everyone. And as a matter of fact, members of several of their communities have started using Tau and Rai in their own projects, notably Dinosaur, who's doing a wonderful integration of Rai so that they can build desktop applications. And they take care of the rest of the bundling on their side. And it just goes to show that there's a lot of possibilities out there. And by modularizing your libraries, you can make them accessible to people who might not want the whole kitchen sink, right? So I'll just briefly talk about a couple of the features that the Tauri project brings. So first and foremost on everyone's mind here is, do I have to install Node.js? You don't. The entire CLI is actually built in Rust. We have a Node.js wrapper that you can use if you're a yarn/npm/pnpm user, which is totally acceptable. Most of the frameworks out there, front-end frameworks that is, are still attached to the Node.js ecosystem. This is changing a little bit, with projects like Dominator and Vue. And potentially in the near future with Svelte. We'll see how that goes. And so other features, and I talk about this a lot, menu, system tray, accelerators, but actually that's kind of the stuff that you expect, right? An application on your device should have a menu, should have edit, copy, paste, quit. If you want a system tray, there should absolutely be a system tray with an icon that you can update. And if you press Control Q, then it should, if that's what you want to do, quit the application. it should quit the application. We also offer multi-window systems. One common use case for this is to spin up a transparent splash screen while the bulk of your application is loading. But you can also make a sort of headless application that just lives in the system tray. There's also a lot of use cases for that. And we've even seen some Jenkins, that's not the name, some Jarvis? I forget the name, but this type of Spotlight application where you can highlight some word and then press a key combo and a web view will pop up exactly at that location. And just a little small strip, and it's basically what you would expect as an application designer, and we try really hard to maintain those conventions. And of course, there's other things like system notifications, but also in-app notifications, and then we have the updater. And this is something that always felt a little bit bolted on for other systems, and so we built an updater service, learning the lessons from other frameworks. And I'll get to the updater in a second. We have a couple announcements for you all here today. And obviously there's also dev tools. So in the web view, you can hook into the JavaScript console. You can step through, you can analyze the traffic, the memory consumption, basically everything you would expect from a modern HTML, JavaScript, CSS renderer. We also provide a secure context without strong arming you into using a local host web server. And it's sort of low key, I think, but it's one of the things that we're very proud of. And that is in isolation type projects, in greenfield projects where you get to design how you do everything. Just because you're using HTML, CSS, and JS for the user interface doesn't mean you have to comply with the rest of what HTML is. If you want to use the noise protocol to communicate with your remote service or with the backend core, you can do that. And we don't open up some random port on your computer over HTTP. So there's no clobbering and also no listening. So your application is, again, smaller and has less attack surface. Like I said, we provide macOS, Windows, and Linux. And we have a GitHub action for building all platforms. We're working on a GitLab version of that, but it's complicated. I'm not going to talk about that today. It's future. And it works with all web frameworks. I will mention one key thing. I'm not good at calling people out. But in this case, I think a commendation is definitely in order. If you're familiar with JavaScript, there's a thing called the object prototype. And you can, as a developer, modify that prototype. As a hacker, it's great stuff. It's really fun to modify the prototype. And one of the security features that we are offering in 1.0 is the ability to freeze that prototype, which means that people that you probably don't want messing around with the prototype can't. There is one framework out there that we've noticed works fine if you freeze the prototype, and that is Svelte. If you don't know Svelte, big thumbs up to that team. Amazing crew, wonderful, wonderful build system, tiny binaries, logical, or not binaries, but tiny blobs that you render out, and super performant, easy to understand, great to use, highly recommended, and you can freeze the object prototype. Many of the other larger, older frameworks, I'm not going to name anybody, but they play around with the prototype, which should scare you. Anyway, the near future, the fully audited and stable 1.0, that's coming in the next week or two. maybe 3, but we're already at a number of RCs for this big release, and it has been audited. The auditors have approved it. They're still keeping a watchful eye over us. Um, and this is sort of the semi biggish announcement. If you are running a open source project on GitHub, we've partnered with a pretty large company out there called Cloudflare, who are providing the Tauri organization unlimited workers. And what that means is using our updater service, when we launch this with the 1.0 stable, you will get free, globally distributed updates to all of the app users, no matter where they are, which is really great. It means you don't have to tool it yourself. It's been audited by our friends at Radically Open Security, and it's an easy, low friction way for your project to get out there, and it will ultimately save you time and effort. So mobile apps are coming. We already have proofs of concept for Android and iOS. They're both obviously differently complicated. We hope to get those out for the 2.0, which we're slating for end of year. But obviously, there's a lot of engineering work that goes into it, and we also need to have it audited. Cross compilation, by the way, again, hats off to Mr. Wavery. Seems to be working. We're in the throes of making sure it is stable and solid, and if all goes well, it'll come out as a recipe for the 1.0. We're working also on security tooling, which, as I mentioned earlier, is something we want you to be able to use in order to have a sense of security in what you're building. And we'll give you warnings if we think, hey, the CLI just performed a static analysis on your project, and we discovered that you're importing everything from the API, but you're only using 2 of them. Maybe you want to prune that down. Then the elephant in the room, bindings to other languages. Why would anyone ever want to use a different language, you ask? Rust is perfect. We're not maximalists. We come from a place where we recognize that every developer might want to do things their own way. They might use C#. They might want to use Dino. They might want to use Java. They might want to use Python. And our plan is, after the 1.0 launches, to create bindings to the core functionality of Tauri so that, instead of merely creating a sidecar, you can actually rig and run an entire Tauri application from the comfort of Emacs and Common Lisp, if that's your thing. So next up, WebRTC. It already works on Windows and Mac, but obviously if you do not compile WebKit GTK yourself, you're not going to get WebRTC. And since that's something that nobody's doing right now, it's not technically available. We are working with Agalia to push this forward. And big shout out to the GStreamer team. Amazing. If you haven't heard of GStreamer, then go back to crawling under your rock, because that project has been around forever and it's still kicking. Next up, GL Windows. We're working on a proof of concept with EGUI. If you haven't heard of it, awesome project. It is fantastic, and we hope to be releasing an update later this summer where that's been integrated and available. It might only be on the next branch because it hasn't been audited. Obviously, you know us. We only want you to be safe. If you're able to audit it yourselves and you think it's safe, then I'm sure it's okay to use in production, but we like to have those guarantees. And so the final thing here is the books. Books, you say, well, yes, Lucas and I are putting together a book called Tauri Foundations. And it wasn't planned that this talk is the day we announce it, but we're ready to announce it. And I thought might as well give a ray of hope out there for all of our supporters who have so kindly donated to help us, get to where we are now. Tauri Foundations is going to talk about, obviously, security, open source, and the guts and innards of what makes a Tauri app. It's not going to be the codex that's coming out later this year. It'll be a much bigger volume where we go into every teeny tiny corner of Tauri. But this book will be coming out in the next several months. There's a link down there. I think that's where you can find it online. Thanks to our publisher, Pact. We're really looking forward to it. And thank you